Hello, human. We're gonna do something a little different today. I am super into like the occult and spooky things and weird things, and I don't know if this could be necessarily described as that, but I do find the Mad Gasser of Illinois, or Mattoon, whatever you want to call it, to be very fascinating. And I literally do think I might have. See, this is strange. I can't remember if I knew about this just from hearing about the incident, or if it was literally because of playing like Shin Megami Tensei. I'm not sure where I heard of it first, but yeah, I think the incident is super interesting. There's like a couple videos I've listened to, but there doesn't seem to be like a whole lot, and maybe not super comprehensive, or maybe just talking about one specific theory about it, which is like, it's all cool and it's all really good, but I wanted to try to look at every possible angle of this and try to get like a timeline and kind of figure out what was going on in Illinois, well, specifically Mattoon, during this time period, to see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, if any part of this could be real and stuff. And what I don't hear a lot of people doing, which is something I want to try to do, is I'm gonna go through like everything I wrote down. I just did like hours of research on the Mad Gasser, try to collect what I did for some of my other videos, where I got like just a whole page of notes on my second monitor right now that I'm gonna go through and explain all my bullet points and everything in these long paragraphs of specific incidents and stuff. So this isn't gonna be like hyper edited or anything. I'm just taking small breaks in the recording, making sure I got my thoughts together before I say stuff. So it's not going to be like super condensed and super well formatted, but more so like I like the idea of just listening to someone's train of thought or stream of consciousness, I guess, so to speak, and just kind of hear the thought process behind everything and around everything, and just kind of more of a casual listening experience. Because to me, I like super long videos and just hearing people talk about different especially different like spooky topics, but yeah, just like I just want you to like chill out and just listen to the video, just enjoy yourself, maybe get some new information. You can do what I'm doing right now, get yourself a cup of coffee and just just relax and enjoy all the notes I'm about to go through, and see if you gain anything out of this video. So with that, we're gonna start with the top of my note page right here. We're gonna just talk about Mattoon as a town in Illinois. My thought process being is if there was anything going on in the town during this time period that would add to any of the incidents, if it would explain anything, if it would disprove anything, if it would just add more credibility to anything, or rationale behind things, or motives, or whatever. So the very first thing I was doing was looking into Mattoon itself around the 40s. So I was trying to see if anything else weird like happened in this town, as far as anything like possibly, I don't know, paranormal or weird or anything. Not that I don't really think the Mad Gas is a paranormal thing, but to see just if anything happened or any high profile incidents, so to speak. There's a couple things. The one thing that could be noted here, I don't think it's relevant at all, but I felt it was a big enough point to bring it up, is that it was the site, Mattoon specifically, the town, the site of the third deadliest tornado in Illinois in 1917, so before the incidents themselves happened, with unfortunately over 100 people were killed during the tornado, and almost 638 people were injured during this tornado. So it was definitely a huge event at the time and very catastrophic. But I don't think anything, 20-some years later would have any sort of a lasting impact still after that. But it was close enough and a big enough deal where I felt like it might be worth bringing up, because you never know, somebody could have lost their house, lost their business or something, and that might be some sort of financial motivation to try and rob people, which some people think maybe that's what the Mad Gasser is trying to do. So we're gonna bring that point up. The tornado was a pretty huge deal. That was 1917. Now, however, my next point here, which if anything kind of disproves a lot of things in my opinion, was that literally during the same time period there was a small oil boom in Mattoon, where there's a lot of petroleum stuff going on. So economically speaking, it was pretty decent for the town, and even more so if we're looking at the time period of the 40s, which would be like right after World War II and stuff, like economically in America, things were like were really good from my understanding, from what I was looking into, because I was trying to look at like the general economy during this time period, because that could really dictate whether or not there's more credibility to the Mad Gasser just being like a thief, essentially. But everything from the small oil boom to the general American economy in the 40s, everything is kind of pointing towards things were like in a like a post-war economic boom. So I don't necessarily see the economic side of things, but again, that's super generalizing, and all it takes is one person to be on hard times for that to start seeming like a viable option. But however, I do think generally it is important. It's not like we're talking about like the Great Depression levels of economic hardships or anything. So that should set the stage, economically speaking, for Mattoon at the time. And this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what's going on. I just felt this was kind of interesting to bring up as far as the town itself, because I feel like trying to understand maybe some of the bigger things that happen, bigger incidents in the town, can kind of help give you an understanding of how the town itself was and the general happenings during the town. Way later in 94, it was the site of the Omega Trust fraudulent investment scheme thing, and I was looking a little bit into this too, just because it was kind of interesting, but the whole video is not going to be about this, but just the fact that it happened in the same town, and it was also kind of like economic related. There was this guy that was claiming to have like a religious mission, and he was getting people to invest money into him, and because he said he was gonna do important stuff with this money. And I'm not gonna get too far into it, but like essentially like something to do with like fraudulent banknotes and investing into European businesses and stuff. If I'm remembering what I was reading correctly, because I didn't write too many notes for this because it wasn't a super big deal. But yeah, apparently it was a super big fraudulent thing that happened, and there was. By the time the 95 rolled around, this guy, I forgot to write his name down, but he received $10 million from the residents, it sounds like. And maybe not just the residents of Illinois, but it sounds like it was mostly concentrated in this Mattoon town. And so yeah, he received $10 million from them. And eventually, luckily, he was found out and stuff, and he was sentenced in 2002. Now, I don't know if I'm reading the numbers wrong, but what it sounds like is after all the court stuff happened, the restitution from this case was only around $1 million. And I'm making sure that I'm reading these commas right and the number placements. And I'm like, is it really only like it? Because it was like $1 million. I don't want to say like maybe 600,000 compared to the 10 million they received. I just thought that was an interesting case that happened, like obviously way later, but another weird economic thing that happened in Mattoon. So I felt that was worth bringing up in that whole case. Maybe I'll go more into that at some point, because there was like a lot to that. I don't want to bog down the whole video with the Omega Trust fraud thing, but I felt that was worth bringing up. So next point I want to get into here is like population density, because I feel like this would play a huge role in how certain things could play out as far as incident timings and days and stuff like that. So now I've never like tried to research population density and how big certain areas are in comparison and all this kind of stuff before. This is a completely new research topic for me. I've like never done anything like this, so I'm hoping I'm correct in my assessments of things. Obviously, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about like a lot of things. So I'm not the voice of authority on this. I'm just trying to do research on this, mostly in case you want to know like what I'm looking at. I'm trying to read everything that's on Wikipedia and then go to all their sources and look through their sources and make sure there's no huge discrepancies in anything. And then if there's a certain point that stands out, then I go independently search that as its own topic and like the census stuff, or a certain case like the Omega Trust fraud, and then with certain points too, just start looking at completely different websites after the fact that weren't listed as sources, just to see if they have anything different to say, simply by trying to Google different things or see what actual people were saying about it, or read certain newspaper articles like an archive.org from the time and stuff. So I'm trying to be thorough about this. I'm trying to still make it concise, but I'm not just trying to like make stuff up. I'm really trying to make sure what I'm saying makes sense and has credible sources behind it, unless I state that no, there's no credible source. But So, no, I'm not a voice of authority in this, but I am trying to be truthful in what I'm saying. So, anyways, we're going to go back to my researching of population density. So, in 1940, there was roughly a little under 16,000 residents. It's roughly the same now. It's like a little above 16,000, if I'm remembering right. So, the population size has relatively stayed the same. However, from my understanding, it's a pretty condensed city. Like, there's a lot of people per square mile. So I was trying to look at averages in the U.S. and granted, I'm looking at averages for today, but granted, the population size hasn't changed that much. So apparently, the average in the U.S. currently is about 100 people per square mile in cities and stuff. However, Mattoon is one of the more densely populated areas, being roughly 1,600 per square mile. So there's a lot of people packed into this town, and that could explain certain incidents where, like, oh, this happened the same night that this happened. How could that happen? If we're talking about, like, rural countryside cities, for the most part, that's probably, like, improbable, especially if we're talking about 1940s transportation and movement and stuff. However, with this town seemingly being so compact, I definitely think you can definitely excuse a lot of these things that would be discrepancies in smaller, well, not smaller towns, but more spaced out towns with less population and stuff. It's not like it's unfeasible to move around this town quickly, so to speak. From my understanding, it's kind of hard to understand population density when you've never done any research on it. But from everything I'm reading and trying to compare notes and stuff, it seems like it was a very dense town. So movement wasn't really a factor in whether or not it'd be possible to get to another resident in time, is the point I'm trying to make here. So I think that does a pretty good job of setting up the town and some notable events and kind of how it is spaced out and stuff. So next thing I'm going to get into real quick, because I'm going to get into these points later as I'm reading through the incidents, but we're going to talk about, like, the appearance and what people were saying the Mad Gasser looked like. And there was actually something I never even knew about this incident until I was researching it. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But obviously, the appearance mostly comes from the first testimony, being that the Mad Gasser described as tall, he was thin, he had dark clothing, and, like, a tight-fitting hat. So that's kind of the perpetrated appearance of the Mad Gasser from, like, all the testimonies and stuff after that. However, there was another report, and I saw multiple things later, too, that had little, like, maybe not references, this is not the right word, but that would coincide with this, is that there was some talk that it was a female, like a woman dressed up as a man, which I have not heard that before, and there's a couple interesting points about that I'm going to get into later. But just so you have in your head kind of what this Mad Gasser supposedly looked like, and the possibility that it was a woman trying to appear as a man, which has certain ramifications to some of the different points that were brought up by different people's testimonies from during the time. I thought that was very interesting, and we're going to get into that more later, but we'll do it when it's more relevant. So the other main thing from testimonies from this time was the fact that he carried, well, I say he, but that the Mad Gasser carried a tool for spraying, like, pesticides, an FLIT gun. So that was generally the accepted, I guess, weapon of the Mad Gasser, like spraying pesticides, but using that type of machine to spray chemicals, or type of tool to spray chemicals. So with that kind of out of the way, that way you kind of know in your head what we're supposed to be thinking of here. We're going to start going into the incidents, and this is where it's probably going to take the longest. We're going to go through, maybe not in super precise detail for everything, because that might drag this on a lot, but I am going to bring up the major points. I'm going to bring up most major incidents. I'm not going to go through every single incident, because a lot of them don't even have, like, sources I can find. Just like, hey, this happened, but the victim is unnamed, the times aren't, there's no, like, exact times, so we just get, like, a day, and, oh, they may have been attacked by the Mad Gasser. So let's start with the first major incident. So this wasn't the first incident that was reported to the media, apparently, but it was the first chronological incident. So what apparently happened was that around 3 a.m. that the victim woke up, early hours, because he smelled something weird. I don't think he described it as something sweet like other people later did, but essentially it was a strange smell. And it made him feel nauseous, it made him feel weak, and he vomited after, like, inhaling the gas or the smell or whatever. And it was suspected that it was gas poisoning from, like, say, like, ovens at the time. And the wife went to go check the stove to see if, like, it was left on. Well, she wanted to go check it. However, she reported being paralyzed and unable to leave the bed. So she couldn't check it, but it suspected that it was a gas poisoning, but she felt paralyzed and she couldn't move. So that was one of 4 accounts on the same exact day, including 2 different cases, if I'm understanding right, of 2 separate cases, both involving children getting sick from the gas, all on the same day, if I'm understanding this right, because the timeline's a little fuzzy to kind of understand exactly what was going on, but that's what I'm getting out of it. So, the multiple incidents on the same day, but like I said, with how dense this town was, it's not an impossibility. So, now here's where I'm getting a little confused on timeline, because there was, like, apparently 4 accounts on that day, including the case of the 2 sick children, different households. And it was either later that night or the next day that another very important incident happened. I think this was the incident that kind of started everything. So this next incident is the one that was reported to all the media and stuff at the time. It was either later that night, next day, don't know quite when it happened, but apparently around like 11 p.m., a woman was smelling like a strong, sweet odor that she thought was possibly like flowers outside her window. And this is something I want to bring up too, that all these things seem to be happening by bedroom windows. So I think it was the same thing for the first, like, chronological case too. So I want to get into that more later. But so she smelled the odor, and then she became very sick, and she lost a feeling in her legs. And she called her sister, who was in the house at the same time, and the sister noticed the smell, and she noticed it was coming from the direction of the bedroom window, which at the time was open. Which I'm not sure what to make some of this stuff, because I was trying to look into, like, the climate of Illinois at the time, because this is taking place around September, like early September, and it sounds like it gets very, very cold in Illinois, especially like the winter. However, this is more like fall weather, and some of what I'm reading is like fall's kind of pleasant in Illinois, but winters can be super harsh. So it's hard to know if, like, the windows being open during this later time of the year is an abnormality or kind of the norm. I felt like it was worth trying to piece it together if I could in any way, shape, or form, to try to see if there was like a link to any of this, whether or not it made sense for all these different windows to be open at the time, just weather-wise. I know that's kind of a reach and a stretch, but figured I would try to look into it to see if there's anything that would make things make more sense or not make sense or whatever. So, window was open, sister smelled it too, and then she contacted the police. However, there was no evidence, but here's where the next part comes in, is that the husband of a woman who was in the home, he came home around midnight, a little after midnight, and apparently he saw a man hiding by the windows, and the man fled before being caught. And I'm pretty sure he said, like, man, not woman. So that, we'll get into that more later too. And that the mad gasser fled. The husband was a taxi driver, and that's why he was coming home at like such a later hour. So what I'm wondering too is that so far, like, the mad gasser apparently knows where the bedroom windows are and may even know, like, the schedules of the households. So I'm wondering if it was someone that knew people somehow. I'm not sure about that, but I felt like that was definitely worth bringing up, because he seems to, like, understand where certain rooms are located and certain schedules of people, at least so far. And that apparently earlier in the day, the wife and sister were counting money, like, probably viewable through a window. I'm assuming. I didn't quite get any real information on how this would have been known. Maybe they themselves said it, but that, if somebody knew who they were, maybe they would have known about this large amount of money. However, the mad gasser, obviously fled before they could rob anything, but that also ties back into, was this really economically necessary at the time, or was this just a theory that they were coming up with? However, anyways, this was reported to the police, and it was reported to the local media at the time, and so when they were reporting to the media, they're the ones that came up with like the tall, thin, dark clothing, tight cap, and maybe the pesticide sprayer itself. I'm not quite sure on that one. And so while reporting the meeting and everything, the wife was complaining of a burning sensation on her lips and her throat. And so I'm looking into chemicals that could possibly make sense for these types of sensations to happen. And that's it's kind of difficult because there's a lot of chemicals that can cause it, but I also don't know how certain molecular structures and stuff are, if it makes sense to be able to spray it like this, how potent things would have to be, because there's certain like acids and stuff that can cause it, but I don't know if that would translate well into like something similar to a pesticide spray. However, really trying to narrow it down, it seems like one of the best matches I could find is like hydrogen peroxide, like what we still commonly use to put on like cuts and stuff. Because at the time, in the 1920s, it was already being used medically, and it can cause the same types of sensations. So I'm wondering if maybe it could have been hydrogen peroxide that was being sprayed through like the pesticide sprayer stuff. That seems to be the most logical guess, in my opinion, as far as what would have been like readily available and what could probably have the same type of consistency to be easily sprayed, and you wouldn't have to make anything. You could just probably purchase it and use it. So, going back to that. So, motive, possible robbery, counting money, a husband wasn't home. However, they weren't robbed because the gasser was unsuccessful. And the newspaper themselves even said at the time after they reported the media that it possibly wasn't anesthetic or gas. So, that kind of goes back into maybe medical things like I'm thinking, possibly. And this was incorrectly reported as the first incident, even though chronologically, apparently, there was the previous incident that happened. Granted, it, like from what I'm reading, it does say incorrectly reported as the first incident, but is it incorrect or is the first incident even true? Now, I don't want to get too much into my opinion yet. It's just something to think about for now. So let's get on to the following incidents that were happening kind of back to back. So there's multiple incidents in the following days, and most notable being on September 5th, when the timeline's kind of either August 31st if we're talking about the first chronological incident, or around September 1st if we're talking about the first reported incident, if I'm getting my dates correct here. So on September 5th, a woman came up to her porch. She found a cloth, and she smelled the cloth. God only knows why. And she became very ill after, and she was swelling up, and she had that same burning sensation that the previous woman complained about. However, just to kind of put things into place here, that was already reported in the newspaper at the time. So just keep that in mind. And she vomited, however, like the first actual incident, which at the time I don't know if that was even known. So something else to kind of put in the timeline here, that she vomited like the first incident that may not have even been widely known at the time. So she also reported the same sense of paralysis in her legs, and she hypothesized that the cloth was left on the porch for her dog. So maybe that the gasser could have the dog unfortunately sniff the cloth, and maybe the dog would get kind of like knocked out or unable to move, and then the gasser could enter the home. So I'm trying to understand why the gasser would do this instead of just spraying either, unfortunately, like I said, the dog or just the house owners themselves. Obviously, with the dog, if it was like a guard dog or something, or the dog was very protective, obviously the dog could be a problem, could make noise, all that kind of stuff. But I don't understand why the cloth would make sense over spraying it. If, however, the incidents were already kind of getting thrown around in the newspapers, maybe the cloth would be a lot less noticeable, and you wouldn't be seen carry around a pesticide container, like, say this was in the middle of the day or something, because obviously people would start suspecting you if that was the case. So that's kind of what was going on here. The cloth, she's saying, was left for her dog. That way the gasser could actually come into their home. So that kind of ties back into my thinking. Does the gasser know these people? Are they aware of their schedules, of, like the dog sitting on the porch and stuff? That kind of, all these incidents are making me think, like, does the gasser know these people somehow? And apparently, and here's where I think things are getting a little suspect, so to speak. Or around the porch, the woman also found a skeleton key, which, if you don't know, was kind of like a tool from that doesn't really like work anymore with modern locks and stuff. But a skeleton key would essentially open a lot of locks just with a single key, and it was described as being well used, whatever that means. Maybe it was really worn down or something. And the one thing I do find interesting about this, though, is that she did report finding lipstick near the porch. So, if you remember, I was talking about how the one person was thinking that it was a woman dressed up as a man, and now apparently she found lipstick. So, two things with this. Either it was a woman, and they were using lipstick, but then that's not really a woman dressing up as a man. Or, the other thing I'm thinking, what about if it was a man trying to look like a woman to try to make people think they were looking for a woman instead of a man, and, leaving something like lipstick behind to be like, well, could be a woman instead. That could go either way. And I think that's really interesting that two separate people mentioned something related to the gasser possibly being a woman, or looking like a woman, or looking like a woman dressed as a man, or, whatever. But I see, because I've never even heard about the whole woman side of this theory before, so I find that very fascinating that there's different accounts all pointing to that hypothesis that I've never even heard of before. So, obviously, police were called. The police took the cloth that the woman smelled, and now the police said there was no chemicals on the cloth that could have caused those symptoms. However, what I couldn't find through looking through the different articles and stuff is, was there any chemicals on the cloth, and maybe they just didn't understand at the time that this could cause that, or was there literally no chemicals on the cloth? Because that can mean two very different things, and that could go in very wildly different directions. However, I don't know. I don't know if no chemicals were found on the cloth, or if no chemicals that they thought at the time could cause this. Because I'm sure us now, 80 years later, have a better understanding on what certain compounds and chemicals can cause certain reactions that maybe they didn't quite understand back in the 40s. So that's definitely worth pointing out, because this is now police are starting to have like a piece of evidence that they could look at, and this might start tying into their line of thinking later on. But the police are pretty much saying, no, there's nothing on this cloth that could explain your symptoms. So the same night that this happened, the gasser apparently broke through another woman's window and attempted to gas her. So what I don't understand about this is the window again. So the mad gasser, broke the window while the other windows were just already open. So again, this goes back to how was the climate at the time, how was the weather, were people leaving their windows open, or were they not? Would the gasser break a window if it wasn't already open? That seems that's a very different approach, because I feel like it takes a different type of person to either, say, spray a chemical through an open window, to advancing all the way to actually breaking the window and making your crime that much more physical and different. I feel like I don't feel like the same person would both meticulously spray chemicals through an open window and then would also break a window at the same time. I feel like that's a lot more of a, maybe not barbaric, but a simple way of doing things. And so that's a way different account of the same type of incident. So, and again, with it being the same night, I do feel like it's possible with the population density of this town, so I'm not overly concerned with that aspect of it. So at this point, through everyone calling the police and everyone talking to the newspaper and stuff, it sounds like around this time that people were really starting to freak out, like understandably so. Like, small town, dense population, some maniac is going around spraying chemicals in people's homes. So, from my understanding, people started forming like groups and patrols to look for the gasser. And I mean like just average people, normal citizens. And apparently they were armed and they were ready to find this guy. And so everyone's kind of freaking out. And the police were starting to worry about citizens becoming maybe, a little too eager to catch the gasser and maybe harm someone that might be completely innocent, or just start spreading panic and physical violence and stuff. So everyone's freaking out. Police wanted people to not freak out. And so it's either for the safety of the citizens themselves, hey, we don't want you to get hurt by the gasser, or what I'm thinking the police are more so meaning that they didn't want the citizens to hurt someone jumping the gun and thinking that someone's the gasser that isn't. So at this point, around September 12th or so, there's a lot more physical evidence people are bringing to the police. There's footprints. Strangely, there's tears in window screens, which again, why is there tears in window screens when before he just sprayed through the windows? There's little discrepancies here. And by September 12th in this timeline, so about, 12, 13 days after everything's happening, which is kind of a short time period when you really think about it in the grand scheme of things, the police were like, all right, we're getting so many false reports of people smelling gas or seeing the gasser that they needed to try to kind of quell the fears of the public, because they thought that everything was just getting exacerbated by the public at this point, and that they were blowing everything out of proportion. Everyone was panicking. It's kind of the police's line of thinking at this point. They said that a lot of it could be people's anxieties from their spouses being in the war or coming home from war and all this kind of stuff. Kind of the way I'm kind of seeing this, and the 40s were a different time, but it almost sounds like, because they specifically said like women's anxieties from their husbands being away, it almost sounds like they're kind of trying to downplay and be like, well, it's just women, overanalyzing things and being a little crazy. And, for the 40s, maybe that was a par for course explanation from the police, but to me that kind of seems like trying to just, brush over things and just try to kind of move along and away from the incident. So that's what the police are pretty much trying to say at this point on the 12th, that, hey, everybody's freaking out, everybody needs to stop. We don't think it's, we think it's people just overblowing things. And then after the incident, after the police report on this, that the incidents apparently just like died off. However, after this, there's like one more big claim that it was a woman did claim to see the gasser and claimed that it was a woman dressed up as a man. So again, we're going back to that again. So there are multiple accounts of people thinking that the gasser was a woman dressed up as a man. And one thing I do find interesting is that a lot of the accounts are from women. However, there was still, from the first reported incident in the media, the husband did say that they saw someone in the bushes. So it wasn't just women that were apparently seeing the gasser or having incidents. It was, there was a man in there too. And granted, I don't personally think that the gender of these people are really affecting the claims or anything. But if we're talking through the lens of like 1940s America and what everybody is thinking at the time, especially with the police and what people's general opinion on certain actions and thought processes being tied to, women or men, I do think it's important to bring it up in that sense. However, personally, I don't think it really makes a difference. But if we're going down this line of thinking, then yes, a man did see the gasser as well. And I also do think it's interesting when all these things are being reported by mostly women, that there's also reports of the gasser being a woman. I do think that's a very interesting, maybe not take on this, but interesting point to bring out. It almost seems to go against what your stereotype for the time period of someone like assaulting people and trying to break in their homes. You, especially for the time period, you normally didn't see this stuff attributed to women. And I kind of think it's interesting that the fact that the police are blaming it on women's hysteria, while also there's accounts of the gasser themselves being a woman. I'm not sure the connection to make from that, but I do think it's almost asynchronous from the thinking of the time period, and there's something strange about that. I think that's incredibly interesting, because I don't know if for a woman at the time it would be beneficial to claim that the attacker was also a woman, or if they could just say, oh, it was a man or whatever. I think that's very interesting. I'm not sure quite what to make out of it myself, but I do think it's something to think about. And like I said, I haven't even heard of that point before I started researching it today. So that's kind of the end of most of the incidents. And I'm still going to get to my general overall opinion later, but now I want to go into like the popular theories of what the Mad Gasser actually was. So let's go with the first one, the first major one that everybody usually attributes it to, would be mass hysteria. So the one officer from the time thought, okay, there's a real attacker. Someone did at least get attacked. However, was thinking that multiple of the incidents and claims after this point were just overblown due to hysteria. However, a different officer in that department, I'm assuming same department, small town, thought that there was no attacks at all. And that they claimed that it was just the wind-carrying chemicals from a nearby industrial facility. So they think that all the physical symptoms were just from hysteria. And that, to me, I mean, they have to come from somewhere, though. The first incident can't just spring up from nothing. And I'll get to that more later, but it just, put that in the back of your head for now. And that the newspapers, too, from the time, if we're going with the mass hysteria point of view, documented the first case in the media as the first attack. Specifically, first attack in the newspapers, signifying that they thought that there was going to be more attacks, and maybe that led into more mass hysteria. So the police kind of think it's hysteria, and maybe the newspapers kind of perpetrated that a little bit, and then maybe you could blame it on nearby chemical pollution. And so that ties into the second major theory, being pollution, that possibly from the nearby factories, I think there was a factory that made cleaning chemicals, which ties all the way back into me thinking maybe hydrogen peroxide, and that could be the cause of the symptoms. However, the main plant that was being accused of this at the time was saying for the products they were making, the volume of it would have had to be way too high for it to even start causing the symptoms if we're going by like pollution or the wind carrying chemicals and stuff. And the plant themselves were inspected during the time of the gasser, and the Department of Health claimed that they were completely good to go. And the plant was also claiming, hey, if we were the root cause of this, our employees would be sick as well, and they weren't. And that leads me on to the third theory, that it just simply was a real person that was actually doing this. So, just like the theory says, that the sightings had to come from somewhere, and was everybody faking it? That's kind of doubtful. There had to have been some sort of point to trigger everything. And there was this book I was seeing from 2003 by this chemistry and physics teacher. They claimed that there was a very specific person that could have been the gasser, named Farley, who apparently he drank too much and he had this secret laboratory, and his lab exploded at one point, disturbing the residents, and he experimented with chemicals. And this chemistry teacher did claim that was also the same chemicals the police at the time were claiming, which was like what the factories were making at the time. So all these chemical things kind of lead back to the same place. However, and I do think that this is, I'm not sure what to make of this point, because some of what he's saying, I feel like it's like way too much. However, I don't have the book myself. I didn't read the book, but okay, I could understand if it was like one townsperson who was a bit of a drunk and he was really interested in chemical compounds and stuff like this. But I'm having trouble believing this guy had a secret laboratory and that the lab exploded and caused the residents panic. And my line of thinking with this, and I'm not trying to discredit the author, because like I said, I haven't read the book, and I don't know how like serious he was about these claims. But say that this guy was known to exist, and the residents knew that he had a laboratory that blew up. Well, maybe not knew it was a laboratory, but that apparently there's information this guy played with chemicals, and there's a public disturbance incident with an explosion. Don't you think people at the time would have been like, hey, Maybe it's that Farley guy. Maybe he was doing something. You know, the guy in town that's known to be playing with chemicals and may be super interested in combining them and doing stuff with them. Granted, again, I'm not trying to discredit the author or anything. I just feel like there would have been somebody bringing that up during the actual time period this was happening. So I don't know how much I think of it being this Farley guy himself. However, you know, it is worth bringing up just so we're aware of what other people are thinking of later on, like way after the incident. So those are the three main theories that I feel like are plausible. However, there's some more fun ones too. And I was literally going to say aliens as a joke, because I like when people joke about that when they're talking about, you know, more incidents rooted in reality, and they're like, oh, but definitely aliens, you know. However, some writers claimed that it wasn't alien, it wasn't extraterrestrial, that apparently, if I'm understanding this right, that there was art from like a description in this book, and somebody claimed the art didn't look like a person, and that it had to be an alien instead. Well, they didn't say alien, they said extraterrestrial, but, you know, that due to the description and the art of the Mad Gasser, that, hey, this was probably an alien. So, no, I don't think it was an alien, but let's keep it on the table. And for my last theory that I was reading about, I think this site I was reading on was literally, you know, just for fun, just to make up spooky ghost stories. However, by skimming through the article, there was a lot of like actual factual stuff too, and that they were getting a lot of this information what seemed like pretty concise and in a good timeline and correct. So I don't know if it was just like a joke, but they hypothesized that the gasser was a visitor outside of our dimension and understanding, some sort of extra-dimensional being, like straight out of the Mothman prophecies, and he just warped into our dimension and caused a little mayhem just for fun, and then just kind of bounced after. So let's keep that in mind. However, you know, I was just reading that just because at that point I'm like, that's kind of funny and stuff. But they did say in that article, and this is what's strange to me, we're talking about all these theories and stuff, or not theories, but people thinking that the gasser was a woman. And in this article, now granted, I don't know if they had a source for this or anything, but they said some of the footprints that people found earlier were made by high heels, like, you know, stuff that stereotypically speaking at the time women would be wearing. So I find that interesting that it may have been women's shoes. And what also, like, what kind of high heels are we talking about? Are we talking about ones that aren't even mobile? Because then at that point, how are you running away from the window when, like, the husband, the taxi cab driver, saw you? But also, maybe they changed their shoes around. But just the fact that this article also claimed that there was footprints made by something women would usually wear. I find it interesting how many little details are like that when I've never even heard about that before. Granted, no, I don't think it's a visitor outside our dimension. But, you know, there's the three real theories and the two funny ones. And pretty shortly we're going to get to what I think about this. However, I do kind of want to talk about the lasting impact of the Mad Gasser in media, because I think this kind of stuff's always interesting, how different forms of media interpret local legends and stuff, especially maybe writers and stuff that are outside of our country and how they interpret different incidents. The main one I know, and I brought it up before, but I know of the gasser, I think primarily through playing the SMT games, and I think definitely I probably first saw the gasser in like SMT Strange Journey. They have a very interesting depiction of the gasser, and like a lot of like poison attacks, and he has the little the artwork of the gasser kind of goes along the lines of the reported sighting of him being like tall and thin and wearing like all these black clothes and a hat, and he had like the pesticide spray and stuff. I think the artwork's really cool and a really good depiction of the gasser, and kind of leaning to the fact that, you know, he's poisoning people essentially, and that's kind of what he does in the games when you recruit him or fight him or whatever. That's the ones I know of firsthand, and I know they just brought back the Mad Gasser and Soul Hackers too. I thought that was really cool to kind of bring that back. That's kind of what got me thinking about the Mad Gasser again. So that's what I know of it, but I was also reading the other things Wikipedia was talking about, and I tried myself to look if there's any other like Mad Gasser stuff in different forms of media, but literally all I could find was just what Wikipedia was talking about, so I don't know if this is a comprehensive list or not. But I guess there was also an action figure of the Mad Gasser from the Monster in My Pocket line of figures. Now, I never had these as a kid or anything, and I don't know, I don't know if this was kind of in line with what they were doing, and it kind of sounds like maybe it was, but it also sounds like they ended up changing the name in reprints or something to something completely different, but that there was, an action figure of the Mad Gasser for kids. That's wild. Like, what kid is going to care about the Mad Gasser and be like, hey, parent, could you please buy me that Mad Gasser Monster in My Pocket action figure so I can play with it? Like, I don't understand the marketing behind that, but I think that's incredibly interesting that happened. The other things I was reading, it was that it was mentioned in the science fiction novel called The Body Snatchers as like a cause for what was happening in the novel. And as well, and I've never watched this TV show, but the show Supernatural had the Mad Gasser in it, I guess, in the first season. But they called it something slightly different, but it was supposed to be like the Mad Gasser. So that's kind of what I've seen in media or read about in media that the Mad Gasser has. And surprisingly, it doesn't look like there's like anything else that I could find. I was trying to look for other pieces of media, whether books or movies or a video game or something that would have the Mad Gasser in it, but there's almost nothing. Kind of surprising because from my understanding, this was kind of a big incident, but not too many people seem to use it in different forms of media. So now that we have all that out of the way, something that I don't see too much in these types of videos, granted, there are some people that do, but I want to talk, now that we have everything out of the way, all the major points and stuff, I just want to talk about personally what I think of the incident, and I'm going to be practical about it, but I also, I don't think it's fair to deny everything as just an impossibility, so I'm going to be kind of grounded in my approach, but not completely just throw everything out the window. So, now I want to talk about what I think, and when you're done with the video and stuff, you can tell me what you think about it. You can write a comment about it or whatever, and see where you stand in the line of things. So, what I think about it. Going into this, before I did any research, I'm thinking, this has got to be at least partially true. I don't see this coming out of literally nowhere. And the more I'm researching it, the more I'm kind of leaning towards that still, honestly, even after researching it. And so let me kind of lay down the groundwork of my thinking here. So, at the time, the police when it first happened, weren't completely dismissing it. Granted, I really don't think they thought too much of it at the time, but they also were kind of the perpetrators in brushing everything under the rug and trying to move past it, probably due to maybe public perception of the case at the time and people freaking out and mass hysteria and all that. Granted, I don't know if the police themselves truly believe that there is nothing to it. It almost seems more like it was, we don't know how to solve this, we can't solve this, but we need people to not freak out and start hurting people and hurting each other and doing something irrational, and more of just an easy, maybe not easy way, but a way to quickly just wrap everything up and be like, hey, everybody's just freaking out, there's nothing to this, stop worrying about it, kind of thing. And some of it, in my opinion, seems a little patronizing, and I'm not saying every officer at the time was like this and doing this, but especially the ones that talk about, well, it's just women freaking out. To me, that kind of almost goes back into the line of thinking that a lot of people unfortunately had and still have, where it's just like, women, because of your gender, you're irrational and you can't think and you're just freaking out. It almost feels like some of those stereotypes coming to the top of their thinking and just kind of throwing that out there as the reasoning of everything, just to get people to calm down and just blame women, women freaking out. But from what I'm reading, it almost doesn't seem like they genuinely thought there was nothing to it, just thought that was an easier way to deal with it. But on the same token, you do have to wonder why most of the incidents supposedly stopped right after they made that major announcement to stop, stop freaking out. That I feel like that does have some merit to it. And I know I'm sounding very critical of what the police were doing at the time, but I'm not trying to be. I'm just trying to go off of the information I have and I'm sure there's a lot of just normal good detective work going on that we don't know about. All we can really know is from the bigger statements and the bigger press at the time what was going on exactly. So I'm not trying to be like overly critical on one side or the other, just kind of from the information that we have available publicly. And so, yeah, again, on the same token, is you do have to wonder why they all pretty much stopped after they made that big announcement. However, there was still the one woman who claimed to see the gasser after that announcement, and she was one of the ones that claimed that it was a woman as well. So that's kind of what I think of the police statement at the time, at least. That was kind of more just brushing things under the rug. However, it all comes back to like either the first media incident or the first chronological incident. It's like, this had to come from somewhere. This didn't come from nowhere. I feel like nowadays it'd be a little easier to make something like this up when we have so many different forms of readily available media and influences where we could kind of make something kind of creepy up. Even if we're not really like thinking about it consciously, there's so many different forms of media, so many different movies, games, books, shows, whatever, that I feel like would form a subconscious appearance like this. And I'm not saying like the 40s were deprived of entertainment, but I just feel like visually speaking, there would have been maybe less to subconsciously form this type of appearance up. It's like such a weirdly specific thing. Like, yeah, the appearance could be kind of, murky, just like, hey, it was a tall figure wearing dark clothes and a hat. But the whole, like, pesticide spraying container thing, the FLIT gun, that is so weirdly specific that I don't see how someone would just pull that out of nowhere. Like, something would have had to, in my opinion, trigger that description. So, and that's not like the only reason I think that, but that's too much of a specific thing to come out of nowhere, in my opinion. So I definitely think there's at least one real incident for sure. I don't really see how you could argue that there wasn't, just based on the fact that this idea had to come from somewhere. Now, I definitely think probably a lot of the reports after were probably just fabricated and people either wanting the attention or almost more realistically, I think maybe people just actually freaking out and thinking, especially if they were near different factories and plants that were making certain cleaning chemicals, I could definitely see people maybe less like, oh, this incident happened, now it's my time for fame or something, but maybe more so having it in their head, thinking about, oh, first attack, oh, this is a dense town and stuff, and then you're sitting there at night with your window open because it's cool outside, and you smell something weird, and you're like, oh my god, and maybe that could trigger enough of a physical response through psychological, like, hysteria that you would actually feel some of the symptoms that you read about. But then we have to go back to the fact that there was certain things, like, say, the one woman who smelled the cloth, I would still love to know why she would do that, smelled the cloth and threw up after, like vomited, because I don't know if that first chronological incident was written about in the media yet. So she's having the same physical symptom as something that might not have been in the media yet, but it's the same symptom. And there's a couple points I made throughout the video, like, say, the different sightings thinking it was a woman, that it didn't sound like was heavily perpetrated in the news at the time for people to pick up on that and just regurgitate that. And again, I kind of do think the line of thinking is less doing it for attention and more like, you're going to read stuff in the paper and subconsciously you're going to be like attributing what you think you saw to stuff that would make sense and be like, oh, I saw something weird in the bushes, and your brain's kind of just filling in the details, be like, whether or not you're constantly thinking about it, you're like, your brain's probably filling in the gaps and be like, oh, that's that mad gas that they're talking about in the papers, and then you just kind of know that it is. Not that you're trying to actively lie about it. However, I do think there's too many details that people were repeating that were very similar without them all being in the media at the time, and more so we noticed it after the fact. granted, like I said, the timeline for this stuff's actually kind of confusing, and, if someone has a more concise timeline and a way to explain the events, I would love to, read it and kind of maybe re-go through some things, just myself, just to see if I'm misunderstanding the timeline at all. But I do think there's too many weird similarities that not all were in the media. So, again, every point that I'm making, it's yes, it could be real because of this, but it could be not real because it also makes sense this way. But I still think there's at least one real incident. Honestly, I think there's probably multiple incidents if I'm really trying to think about it. I do think there was at least multiple incidents that happened with the Mad Gasser. I do feel like it was a real person. But then we have to also go back to motives here. That, because I don't, before I get into the motives thing, because that's going along the lines of it being a real person. Mass hysteria, yep, I definitely think there was some of that for sure happening. I don't think it can explain all of it, though, because, again, Mad Gasser has to come from somewhere. Pollution, I think not at all. Yes, pollution's a very big problem, especially nowadays, and I'm sure, especially with contaminated water supplies in different cities in America and stuff, that physical symptoms can happen, and say we had a less media-focused society as we do now with our technology, that you could probably have an incident like this happen just purely based on poor health in different, maybe lower-income American cities with, maybe poor water supplies or poor air pollution or something like this. However, especially with the type of factories that were around the town, I do not see that being the cause. And especially when the one officer, who I think was the same officer saying, and hey, I'm not trying to, throw the guy under the bus, but same officer is women freaking out, was also the one, I think, that was saying the winds just carried the chemicals from the factories into the town. Yeah, no, I don't buy that for a second. That doesn't make any, scientific sense. I don't see how that huge of amount of chemicals, with the employees themselves not breathing any of it in, somehow got wafted into the air and through different people's windows, and then it also broke someone's window, which we'll get into that in a minute too. But again, depending on what things you're taking as fact and what you think are overblown, that theory doesn't make any sense. It's not going to go through different people's windows at different times of days and then somehow paralyze them. You'd have to have such a highly concentrated amount of different chemicals for that to even begin to happen, and that's not getting carried by the air. And I don't think America was as polluted in the 40s as it was nowadays. So I don't think pollution is at all the correct theory on this. Aliens, no. Visitor from outside our dimension, no. So then now we can go back to the motives of the person, the Mad Gasser, because I'm going off the belief that I do think there was a person. So this is where things get really interesting, because as I talked about in the beginning of the video, economically, it seemed like this town and America in general was, United States in general, was pretty good at the time. Granted, like I said, that doesn't cover everybody. All it takes is one person to slip through the cracks, so to speak, that fall in hard times and need to do something desperate to survive, or say feed their kids or whatever. There's a lot of situations that can make people desperate enough to try something. However, I'd be hesitant to say that was the leading theory, because it doesn't sound like anything was ever stolen. And even if the perpetrator knew that there was money involved, granted, in that one case, they supposedly ran away before they had the chance to. But this also goes back to things such as, did the Mad Gasser know these people personally? Because there's arguments for and against that if we're thinking about it in that sense. Because say we go back to the incident with the cab driver and the woman and her sister. So he knew to come when the husband would not be home for, probably just less people there and stuff. And maybe knew that there was money in the house. At least that's what the wife and her sister were thinking. But however, didn't know the schedule enough to know that the husband might have come back. Or maybe just while the Mad Gasser was kind of scoping the area out, saw, say that the husband's schedule was later than it ended up being that night, and maybe the Gasser thought they had to 3 a.m. or something to break into the house and steal something. But then we go back to like the first chronological incident where spraying through the window, and then what? Like, it didn't sound like anything was broken into, and it didn't sound like anything was taken. And if you get into some of the later reports, which these are the ones I don't think have like any truth in them, but like the reports of breaking into a window or tearing the screen open, that I feel like would go more towards the lines of thinking of, oh, they're trying to rob me, which maybe the newspapers at the time were reporting. However, that doesn't really seem to go in line with the other incidents, and I feel like at that point the hysteria was probably already like kind of in place. So I don't think there's any truth to that, but because I also feel like that goes along more with like robbing people. And if you're going to be spraying people through their bedroom windows with pesticide, well, not pesticide, like whatever chemical, I don't think you'd be then resorting to busting the window open and tearing the screen to spray into chemicals. That part really doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would you need to tear the screen to spray chemicals through the screen? That's not how that works. So I don't think robbery was ever a motive if the gas was real. And which like I said, I do think it was. The only thing that could really make sense to me is that someone literally just wanted to harm people in a very discreet and in a way without leaving like evidence. Because if you're just spraying through somebody's window, you're not going to be leaving like fingerprints or anything, especially if people were leaving their windows open at the time. And it also goes back to me thinking the Mad Gasser knew these people, because granted, like, I don't know, maybe it would have been easy to kind of like see where the bedroom windows were and then just go over to them, but like they always seem to like be spraying through people's bedroom windows specifically, which seems kind of odd to me. Most people, maybe they knew that these people kept their windows open often for like fresh air and stuff, and kind of knew where and when, if we're thinking time-wise, when they'd be like asleep or drowsy or later at night. They always seem to be doing it at night, and possibly wearing darker clothing so they couldn't quite be seen as well. And the one thing I want to bring up with that too is that say the Mad Gasser, was doing all these things, they were probably pretty smart, because they didn't get caught and they kind of knew how to do things from a distance. And motive-wise, the only thing I can think of is like they literally, maybe a couple screws were loose and they just wanted to hurt people. So going back to the Mad Gasser is a woman train of thought, I'm kind of almost thinking if we're taking the woman with the cloth on the porch as an actual account of what happened, and I'm not saying that we're going to, but then the Mad Gasser may have been trying to make themselves out to be a woman, like, say, leaving the lipstick behind, or trying to make themselves appear as a woman to kind of throw people off their scent, so to speak. So they thought they were looking for a woman and not a man. Or we go on the other train of thought, say that incident's not real, which some of it seems too exaggerated. Maybe it was partially real and partially hysteria, or copycat doing cloth instead of like a pesticide sprayer. Or it was a woman who was attacking people and was trying to make themselves out to look like a man instead, so they thought they were looking for a man. So either way you spin this, I think you could confidently make an argument that if the Mad Gasser was real, that they were probably pretty intelligent what they were doing, and either way it swings, I think that they were trying to throw someone off of what they actually looked like. So I think that kind of covers everything I can really think about. I think some of the incidents are real. I'd say the first couple were probably real. And whether or not the Mad Gasser was a woman or a man, honestly, who knows? I do think it's really interesting that multiple people did think it was a woman. I honestly, I don't think there's enough evidence either way to make a correct assumption, or a confident assumption saying, oh, the Mad Gasser is definitely a man, or the Mad Gasser is definitely a woman. Honestly, with everything I'm reading, I'm not confident to say either. I think it can go either way, and honestly, I think it might have been a tactic to throw people off of who they were looking for, like physically speaking. And motive-wise, I don't think it's robbery, because like nothing of value was ever stolen. If if we're going down the line of thinking that the Mad Gassers, like the incidents actually happened, at least the first couple, which I do think so. Sorry, I know my train of thought is like all over the place. So let me just lay this down. I think Mad Gasser is real. I think the first couple incidents are real. I think they were just trying to harm people. That's what I think of everything after reading through everything. And it's kind of, no, I didn't really think about motives before I started researching, but I feel like even after doing all this research, it kind of just still, I'm in the same train of thought of thinking that this was real incidents, a couple of them at least. I think there's the first couple were real, and I think then hysteria really got to people, and everything was getting overblown. However, I do think the police department kind of made a mistake of trying to throw it under the rug. Now, maybe not, because the real threat definitely could have been people just accidentally hurting each other, trying to catch the mad gas in themselves. However, I feel like they kind of closed the book on that too soon to find out if there actually was something real going on. Though, again, you can make the argument it is suspicious that things kind of stopped after they made that report. But maybe, again, if Mad Gasser is real, they could have just been like, alright, I'm getting way too much attention now. I'm going to stop before I actually get caught for what I'm doing. So, that's what I think of everything. I feel like I laid down everything and all my thoughts and all the incidents and reports and everything very well. It's a super fascinating case. And I'd love to know if there's ever been other incidents of stuff like this, whether it was the United States, whether it was a different country, different time period, because this was 40s. I don't know if something happened on the other side of the world, in the 2000s or something. I don't know. I think this case is so fascinating, and I don't see a lot of coverage on it. So I'm really interested in the Mad Gasser stuff. I wanted to make my own video about it and talk about everything that I could figure out, without going super in depth, because I'm sure if I was really going over all the incidents and really combing through every single newspaper and talking about all of that myself, this video could probably be hours long. But I wanted it to be concise enough and still get my opinion out there. And I'd love to know, anybody that watches this, what did you think about it? Do you think Mad Gasser existed at all? Where do you think the idea of him came from, as far as if the incidents were real? Or do you think it wasn't real at all and it was just mass hysteria? Or do you really think that it was aliens? Alright, it's been a lot of fun looking through everything. I hope you enjoyed this video a lot and just kind of chilled out, relaxed, and listened to it. So, you'll probably be hearing from me again with something, a little more spooky like this, because I really enjoy these types of topics a lot. I'm super into this kind of stuff. I think that about wraps it up. So, later.